I am Inspector, and I solved mystery. Welcome to my new case.
The first cool evenings of autumn carry a sweetness that is difficult to define. The light softens, as if the city itself tires of brilliance, and the air turns faintly acrid with smoke from gardens where leaves have been gathered and burned. I'd walked into the university parks that afternoon, not with purpose, but in search of the small comfort that comes from watching nature surrender itself to decline. Oxford's trees were already patchy with ochre and rust, their reflections tremulous in the river, and my mind, as usual, was occupied with something altogether less poetic, a crossword clue that stubbornly resisted completion. The clue read, "Wet seat, no storm expected." 7. I had been staring at it since breakfast, on and off, with the kind of irritation that only words can inspire. It seemed a simple enough construction, but the answer eluded me as surely as happiness tends to do when one seeks it directly. Even in the act of walking, my mind worried at it, like a tongue probing a cracked tooth. I found myself pausing beside a wooden bench set back slightly from the gravel path. The surface glistened darkly, as though freshly varnished or kissed by rain. Yet I knew the sky had not loosed a drop for several days, the air being dry enough to chap one's lips. I ran a finger across it and felt the faint dampness cling. Odd, though not in itself. Extraordinary. The parks contain mysteries of moisture, dew trapped by shade, or sudden showers localized to a corner of the city. Still, the sight fixed itself in my mind, as a small detail will, like a parenthesis left open in a sentence. I sat instead upon a stone edging nearby, took out the folded crossword, and tried again to coax sense from it. The river moved sluggishly at the boundary of the gardens, and from a cluster of oaks came the laughter of students newly returned for term. The sound, buoyant and callow, was at once pleasing and wounding. Their futures seemed unwritten, mine all too annotated. It was then that I caught the phrase, carried lightly on the breeze as they passed behind me. "They found him here, didn't they?" The voice was male, pitched low, half conspiratorial. Another, brighter, replied, "That's what I heard. On this very bench." Then both were lost to distance, their footsteps swallowed by the crunch of leaves. I folded the paper without finishing. It was not the crossword that concerned me now, but the careless precision of that remark. They found him here. Who was him? And why had the bench, of all places, held my eye moments before? I lit a cigarette, an indulgence against the rules of the parks, though the rules rarely concerned me, and watched the smoke rise, hoping perhaps to draw out memory or meaning. As it happened, I had heard nothing official of a death. The papers I skimmed so perfunctorily each morning had carried no such headline. Yet Oxford is a city skilled in the art of discretion, and the college cloisters can conceal a scandal as deftly as a cathedral wall swallows prayer. A man might die without spectacle, and the knowledge of it seep only through whispers. I rose at length, my knees protesting, and examined the bench once more. Damp along the back slats as well as the seat. Not the work of dew alone, for the shade was insufficient to preserve it past noon. A bottle perhaps spilled, though there was no scent of wine or beer and no trace of sugar stickiness beneath the wood. A small matter, yet one my mind could not relinquish. Crossing the parks, I noticed a single sycamore leaf pressed flat upon the gravel, darkened at its edges, as though soaked. Again, that peculiar suggestion of wet where none should be. I pocketed the folded crossword, still unsolved, and made my way toward the gate. A bell from a nearby college tolled the half-hour, a note of weary authority drifting through the evening haze. The thought returned with unwelcome insistence. They found him here. I imagined the shape of a body on the bench, head tilted back, lips parted, the expression unreadable. A scholar, perhaps, or a student too fragile for the rigors of expectation. Or simply a man who had chosen a park bench for his last quiet rest. I had known such endings in Oxford before. Too many. At the corner, I paused to strike out the letters and the crossword clue once more. Wet seat, no storm expected. 7. Bench, damp, drizzle. Nothing fit. Yet as I walked toward the high, a word began to whisper itself with sly persistence. Calmity. No, absurd. Placate. Still wrong. But the cadence of the clue, like the remark of those boys, would not release me. Both suggested a story waiting, concealed within ordinary words. By the time I reached my car, night had folded over the city, and the parks were lost in shadow. Yet the bench remained in my mind, shining darkly against the absence of rain and the knowledge that somewhere, in that simple piece of wood, a life had ended, though no one yet cared to tell me how. Lewis found me the next morning when the parks were still glazed with the sort of light that makes ordinary grass look curated. He stood with the patience of a man who had rehearsed his report on the walk over. A body 3 nights ago, sir. Lecturer in classics, Dr. Edwin Latham. Found slumped on that bench you noticed. No marks, no disturbance, as neat as a final line. The park keeper took him for sleeping until the flies became persuasive. The coroner is uncertain. The word adrift is poison. Poison, I said, because naming a thing sometimes starves it. Lewis added that no vehicles were seen leaving the gates at odd hours, that footprints were non-committal, and that witnesses preferred rumor to responsibility. It had been a windless night. Sound should have traveled, yet no one remembered a cry. One undergraduate recalled only 2 owls debating jurisdiction. We drove to the flat Latham kept above a newsagent on Banbury Road. The rooms were tidy to the point of reprimand. I opened a window and heard the bell downstairs salute each customer. The place smelled of dry tea and frugal soap. On his desk, a small museum of grievances, clipped letters, penciled amendments, a symposium pamphlet with the keynote corrected in a hand that refused to forgive. Lewis, who prefers drawers either open or shut, hovered at the bookcase. The coroner, he said, had found signs in the heart that told complicated truths. Digitalis residue, perhaps, but Latham had the prescription, so intent slid away from fact like rain off waxed cloth. Do scholars truly make enemies over a line of verse? He asked. Oxford can turn a comma into a wound, I told him. The bench again, I said. Was there any trace of liquid on the wood when they found him? Damp, he answered, but no rainfall. It might have been dew, or tears. I heard in his voice the careful neutrality he reserves for my speculative pursuits. He humors me because, on rare occasions, speculation earns its keep. We left the flat as we found it, which is to say, untouched by love. I carried the impression of a man who made himself easy to ignore. A kettle too clean, a bed arranged with monastic precision, a single tumbler by the sink like an apology. If poison had been used, it had visited a quiet, orderly kingdom that would not complain. I took us to a pub I favor for anonymity. I let the ale warm before drinking. Deaths in Oxford seldom remain obedient to medical prose, I said, and Lewis replied that some decline obedience to statute as well. He offered the roster of antagonists: Calder, head of St. Athanasius; Julian Wren, minor poet with debts, a former student who left suddenly without address. The coroner will run more tests, said Lewis. Sensible, I allowed, and thought sensibility a delicate way of overlooking meaning. Has anyone examined the park keeper's routine? People who move through places at the same minute each day become keyholes. He promised to ask. Then, as if trivial, he mentioned the crossword in Latham's coat, a clue half-worked, a poet misquoted and corrected by an irritated pencil. Houseman again, faithful as rain in March. What pressed upon me was not operatic wrongness, but the aggregation of small nears, the bench wet without weather, the prescription that imitates murder, the list of rivals without relish, the room arranged like an alibi. One trifling deduction offered itself while I watched the pub's cloudy mirror. Someone had wiped a glass carefully and still left a rim. Care cannot always complete itself. Lewis waited for instruction. "We shall visit the college," I said at last, "and admire their courtyards while they rehearse grief." As we rose, my sleeve brushed the ring the ale had printed on the table. Moisture remembers briefly and then forgets, leaving a halo that signifies everything and proves nothing. Latham, I thought, had departed in the same fashion. We stepped into a noon corrected by bells. A light wind had picked up. I felt the old ache, the mingling of curiosity with concern, and quietly understood the case had already chosen me. St. Athanasius receives visitors the way a cautious man takes medicine, with reluctance and a little water after. I remember the quad smelling of laurel and old chalk. Stone kept a thoughtful grey, grass shaved to a severity that made virtue look horticultural. A porter steered us past a notice board where red pins held lectures like butterflies, and left us in the lodge, where tea rose in mild clouds as if secrecy required steam. Professor Calder stood with a courtly inclination of the head, and that brisk, affable manner administrator's perfect when the truth is an expensive commodity. "Please, Chief Inspector," he said in the tone of one inviting rain to behave. He declared the college bereaved. "Scholars quarrel theatrically and then sleep in the same sun," he observed, smiling enough to show he didn't. I asked about the evening. He knew little, which was exactly as much as he intended to know. Latham was brilliant, certainly, difficult, naturally, intolerant of the slab-footed, inevitably. The college, he continued, disliked fuss. Reputation is a hedge. One trims it before the neighbors speak. His fingers made a small gardener's gesture in the air. It was lovely, that hedge. Lewis asked after enemies. Calder preferred standards. There had been, he conceded, an unpleasantness concerning a lecture series and the geography of footnotes. Misunderstanding was his chosen noun. On the desk lay a blotter, too clean to have known doubt. A pen rested parallel to its edge, as if ink might confess while unsupervised. When I mentioned the gardens after hours, his hand rose, palm downward, a conductor stilling the brass. Keys exist. The gardeners hold one, the lodge another, fellows a few more. But really, Chief Inspector, no one strolls at midnight unless healthy or wicked. The sentence tried to include us in its virtue. We sought the garden before we sought the next person. The bench presented ordinary timber under a pale, reasonable sky. The turf had the tranquility of a library that has forgotten laughter. I ran a finger along the back rail and felt a shallow abrasion beneath the varnish, a softened trench where letters might once have declared themselves. Lewis crouched, patient as an archivist, and found nothing but varnish and time. Absence, in Oxford, wears authority like a gown. Sylvia Markham sat in the senior tutor's office at the outermost inch of the chair, alert to the first misbehaving noun. She shaped her sentences like a candidate under viva. Latham was brilliant, she said, and cruel precisely when brilliance required witnesses. He demanded attention, continuous, unblinking. He rewarded it with weather. She had typed his drafts through an irritable winter and then typed them again alone because his corrections were punishment rather than guidance. Did she meet him in the parks? Sometimes. He liked the bench. He said the bench liked him back. Dry amusement, thin as paper. She disliked poison as a word and melodrama as a suggestion. While we spoke, her hands were well-mannered except when the name Julian Wren arrived. Then a tremor at the first knuckle reported and was dismissed. Wren, she told me, was charming in the way of men who practiced charm in mirrors, and he owed money, probably, and apologies, certainly. Latham despised him artistically, which is to say comprehensively. Had she been fond of Latham? She answered that respect is not affection. I noticed the speed of the answer and filed it with other small speeds. Julian Wren received us in rooms that smelt faintly of tangerine peel, printer's ink, and something too sweet for daylight. He proposed rivalry as the college's alternative to sport, and said Latham preferred the part of goalkeeper who enjoys booze. He admitted to walking near the gardens that night because inspiration requires moonlight, as wine requires a glass. Debts were rumor, romance a misreading. He was solvent emotionally and almost so otherwise. Did we prefer receipts or verse? He smiled in italics, then put the smile away. I asked about misquotation. He brightened as if someone had opened a curtain in his mind. Poetry, he said, is deliberate misremembering. I suggested some misrememberings are tactical. He agreed too readily and studied his hands, two fluttering exclamation marks, seeking a sentence. On his table lay a college key on a faded ribbon. Keys travel by friendship, he remarked, which is another way of saying they are not counted. I asked who held the gardener's copy. He admired the question and escorted it to the window where it could enjoy the view. The corridor's boards complained in confidential whispers as we left. Behind the glass, the garden kept its varnished peace. The bench sat where it had sat before men learned how to lie politely. I looked at it and felt the case assemble itself not as a line drawn from A to B, but as a circle that turns while pretending to stroll. A modest deduction arrived and waited by my shoulder. When Calder spoke of standards, he polished an empty surface. When Sylvia spoke of drafts, she measured breath she had been forced to borrow. When Wren spoke of rivalry, he conjugated innocence in the wrong tense. The lawn looked level because 1,000 tiny cuts had been agreed. Lewis asked what I had. A garden, I said, and too many gardeners. He nodded in the way a man nods when worry prefers silence. The wind discovered leaves it wanted and moved them. Somewhere a bell considered an hour and declined it. In my pocket, a folded crossword pressed its quiet geometry against my hand. In my mind, the bench remained damp, though the day behaved, and the feeling returned, the old, intrusive guest, that the answer, when it finally settled, would taste of literature and something colder. The jacket had been folded carefully into the brown evidence bag, as if respect could be manufactured by creases. I took it to my office late one evening when the corridor lamps hummed with fatigue, and tipped its contents gently onto the desk. Among the usual keys, coins and notes, lay a crossword folded to its quarter, pencil still marking half-considered letters. The grid was not promising. Several clues answered in a hand I recognized as impatient, the strokes heavy as though irritation could bully language into place. One clue in particular arrested me. Poet misremembers the land of lost content, 6. He had written Hausma, then abandoned it mid-letter, as though the poet himself had withdrawn permission. A.E. Houseman, whose cadences hung like tolling bells across the melancholy of English verse. Latham had once delivered a lecture, audacious, unforgiving, accusing another scholar of theft, of plucking Houseman's phrases and passing them off like small coins in a dishonest market. I remembered the hush that followed, not admiration, but a sort of embarrassed awe. Oxford loves brilliance and punishes it equally. The misquotation unsettled me. Latham, of all men, would not forget Houseman's line. Into my heart an air that kills, from yon far country blows. He would not misplace a word unless the error itself carried intention. Was the crossword a message, perhaps meant for someone else to read once his hand had cooled, or merely a private amusement, a scholar taunting his own precision, daring memory to falter? I poured a measure of whiskey and held the folded page to the lamplight. The graphite shimmered faintly, as though reluctant to commit itself to permanence. If words could bleed, they would leave such a trace. The next day I sought Sylvia Markham again. She had chosen the Fellows' Garden for our conversation, a place where roses were pruned into submission and gravel paths suggested restraint. She wore her seriousness like armor, but there was a tremor beneath it that she hoped would pass unnoticed. She admitted, after a pause measured to the second, that she often sat with Latham on that bench. The same bench. They spoke of poetry, not scholarship. Poetry, she said, allowed him to lay down the whip for an hour and rest among gentler things. He quoted lines until dusk stole them. She listened because someone ought to. He carried a sadness, she thought, though she rarely asked for its origin. When he grew tired, he leaned against the wood and closed his eyes, as though listening to something inaudible. I asked if she believed herself fond of him. She replied that fondness was too pale a color, that what she felt was obligation, or pity, or perhaps admiration in chains. He could be cruel, she reminded me, yet cruelty sometimes disguises its opposite. Her hands, folded primly on her lap, betrayed the memory of that cruelty by their whitened knuckles. She released them only when I rose to go. In that instant she looked away toward the bench, the silence between us filled by a gust that carried the smell of cut grass and something older, a hint of damp that had never quite dried. Walking back through the cloisters, I considered her choice of words. Obligation, pity, admiration. None of them had been love, yet each circled it with wary steps. The crossword in my pocket pressed its puzzle against my thigh, as if reminding me that words misused or unfinished are as telling as those completed. Lewis joined me later with his usual brisk questions, practical as boots on cobblestones. I offered him little. It was not that I withheld, rather that certainty is the one thing a case cannot afford too soon. Instead, I thought again of that line, misremembered deliberately or not, the land of lost content. For Latham, perhaps, it was not merely a quotation. It was a place he had already visited, and one that waited patiently for the rest of us. That night, as I laid the crossword flat upon the desk, I found myself tracing the half-formed letters again and again, as though they might confess by repetition. They did not. The silence of the paper matched the silence of Sylvia's eyes. Words left unsaid often speak the loudest, though one must lean in uncomfortably close to hear them. The high table at St. Athanasius has a way of rehearsing dignity while permitting indiscretion. Candles leaned into the polished air. Portraits looked down with indifference. The echo of grace still lingered when the first glasses of claret settled into hands. I had accepted the invitation with the disingenuous shrug of a man pretending he had better places to be. In truth, the promise of wine outweighed caution. I remember Margaret Prynne across the table, her pearls a little too careful against the black dress, her eyes dwelling often where words did not follow. She spoke sparingly, though when she did the conversation adjusted itself around her as a compass to north. Vale, seated two down, filled the gaps with the confidence of one who mistakes prolixity for eloquence. He had that tone of a man explaining weather to sailors. The talk, sooner or later, approached Prynne's will. Not Edwin Latham this time, but Prynne, an older benefactor of the college, lately buried with more ceremony than affection. A fellow remarked that the document was unusually complicated, the kind that nourishes solicitors and starves common sense. Vale contributed that Latin always dignifies uncertainty. He cited a tag, in vino sapientia, in aqua oblivio, but stumbled, inverting a word. The phrase was wrong, and wrong in a way that betrayed overfamiliarity rather than ignorance. A man unused to Latin would blunder elsewhere. Vale's slip was one of muscle memory. Like a key turning too smoothly in a door, the chapel chest came into my mind unbidden, that heavy oak box paraded out for rituals twice a year, its lock polished by reverence. Vale's misquotation hinted at more than scholarship. It hinted at the intimacy of touch. Claret thickened my thoughts, but sharpened my ears. Margaret Prynne allowed herself a glance at Vale when he spoke, the kind of glance that belongs neither to affection nor to hostility, but to memory. Later, when the fellows rose and the procession into dessert began, she said to me with a softness that disguised its edge, "My husband was a keeper of many things, some of them not his to keep." The remark floated there, neither invited nor dismissed. She turned her eyes to the candied fruit as if she had confessed only to appetite. I let the claret do its slow work. The fellows muttered of inheritance, of colleges favored and charities denied, of nephews who would now learn disappointment. Latham's death seemed to hover just behind the words, as if wills, benches, and sudden endings were all part of the same syllabus. I recall a moment when Lewis, seated awkwardly at the lower end, caught my eye. He disliked such dinners, their ceremonial waste of time, their shallow pools of Latin. Yet he understood that here, in the spill of wine and trivial scholarship, one hears the truth people do not intend to tell. By the time coffee arrived, the room had loosened into laughter that insisted upon itself. I drank water then, too late, and listened to Vale recalling a story of the chapel's vestments. He described, almost absent-mindedly, how the chest groaned when opened, how the hinges required oiling, how the cloth smelled faintly of cedar. He caught himself, smiled thinly, and asked if the pudding might be passed. I thought of the crossword in Latham's coat, of deliberate misquotations, of words used not as mistakes but as breadcrumbs. When the last port decanter circled, I excused myself with the weary dignity of a man conscious of his head. The quad outside lay dark and self-contained, the air thick with damp stone. My steps echoed against the walls, a single window burned with lamplight, and I wondered whether Margaret Prynne sat behind it, unfastening pearls, measuring her silence against a will that perhaps never told the whole truth. I carried with me the faint suspicion that the case I pursued was not about death alone, but about the private economies of memory. Who keeps what? Who inherits what cannot be written down? The desk gave up its secrets with the reluctance of old timber. Drawers stuck half an inch before consenting, papers rasped like dry leaves. I do not pretend to an archivist's patience, yet something in Latham's housekeeping, order without comfort, persuaded me to linger. Under a ledger of borrowed books lay a shallow envelope, chemist's stock from when the world was still mad. I slid out a single print, sun-bleached at the margins. An Oxford garden party. Linen jackets, teacups, a summer certain of itself. I recognized the lawn before I recognized the faces. The clipped yew, the shallow steps, the exaggerated politeness of borders. St. Athanasius, then, in a mood of forgiveness. Professor Calder dominated the center with his practiced benevolence. Julian Wren lounged 2 ranks away, all casual wrists and curated insouciance. Between them, a young woman, unnamed by the caption on the back, and yet impossible to deny. The mouth was Sylvia's, the gaze Sylvia's, but the hair and the hopeful dress belonged to another decade. She was not Sylvia, and she was exactly so. I carried the photograph to the window. Midday rain had begun with hush, slicking the stone so the college looked newly washed. I thought of the bench that had glistened without weather and felt not certainty, but kinship. I returned the print to its sleeve and walked the corridor to find Sylvia before resolve turned into caution. She received me in the library, where the old air smells of cloth, paste, and suggestion. She was working at a table too large for one person, a mote of books deputized as company. I placed the envelope on the wood and said that the past keeps poor time. She looked at the photo with a practiced neutrality, then let the mask lapse. "My mother," she said, "if we must speak plainly." She came up for a scholarship. She left before summer ended. There are doors that open softly and doors that announce themselves. This one breathed. I asked if the departure involved the college. She answered that the college is a place, not a person, and then amended the thought, people make places. She traced the edge of the photograph, a cartographer measuring an old coastline. I asked about Calder, about Wren. She said that men with easy smiles tend to borrow futures. You think there was a scandal, she added, and I replied that Oxford is powered by scandal the way churches are powered by faith, quietly and with ceremony. She said it was simpler. A brilliant girl fell in love and discovered that brilliance is the wrong currency. My mother went home with a silence she never quite spent. The smile that followed was thinner than paper. I left her with the picture, telling myself that property should be returned to its blood. The quadrangle exhaled drizzle. I arranged for a bottle of indifferent wine at my rooms and tried to let the alcohol purchase clarity. In the glass's dull circle, I examined the alignments the photograph proposed. Calder's protective geometry, Wren's proximity to mischief, the young woman poised at the hinge between them. The pattern felt rehearsed. The wine was no help, but the label was. A cheap Medoc with a crest as counterfeit as a politician's ardor. I thought of Prynne's will, of Vale's over-familiar Latin, of the chapel chest whose hinges know more names than the register. Suppose, I told myself, the rivalries we dignify as academic are simply the aftermath of unconfessed weather. A glance prolonged, an ambition intercepted, a promise offered to the wrong intelligence. A small deduction visited and did not hurry away. If Sylvia's mother had left in a flurry of discretion, someone had smoothed the record. And if the record had been smoothed, someone cherished the smoothing. That someone would prefer Latham's pedantries to remain safely pedantic. Yet Latham had kept the photograph. Men do not keep what they intend to. Forget. I slept badly and woke with the useful headache of a man who has earned nothing. The rain held. The bench would be wet. I told myself that memory is another climate, and that the case, whatever else it proved, would not be solved by documents alone. Passion lingers where footnotes pretend to end for a while. The coroner's report arrived folded twice, as though modesty might soften the verdict. Digitalis, faint and uncertain, yet present enough to matter. Latham's heart had been a compromised machine for years, dependent on that same medicine to beat in rhythm with life. A poison, yes, but also his cure. I read the lines twice and felt no wiser. Death so often resembles life in the laboratory. Lewis asked if it meant murder. I told him it meant dosage, and dosage is interpretation. The line between remedy and ruin is a decimal point. He frowned, unhappy with arithmetic. Calder, however, professed satisfaction. The man had a weak heart, the college, a reputation worth defending. Let us allow dignity for the dead. The phrase tasted of varnish and avoidance. Yet something was wrong. Too neat. Latham was not careless with pills. His cruelty had precision, and precision does not swallow error easily. If medicine killed him, it was through the hand that withheld it, or the hand that pressed too much into his palm. Both possibilities reeked of intention. I thought of the crossword again, of the houseman clue abandoned in irritation. Misremembering is dangerous in a mind so trained. The mistake was too deliberate, too cleanly poised to be accident. And literature, not chemistry, is where scholars conceal their sharpest knives. That evening, rain decorated the quad with silver streaks. I lingered in the chapel, where dust sloped off hymnals and the air smelled of wax. A line of Latin carved above the lectern arrested me. Memento vivere. Not memento mori. A command to live, not to die. I remembered Vale's slip at high table and wondered if misquotation was the lingua franca of secrets. Back in my rooms, I poured whiskey thin and harsh, my head full of half-formed thoughts. Latham's lecture on housemen had accused another man of theft. To steal a line of poetry is, in Oxford, a capital offense. Yet perhaps the lecture had been less about literature and more about possession, of words, of women, of memories. He had not been forgiven. Digitalis, a leaf that soothes or stops, a word that comforts or condemns, a line misquoted or restored. I began to sense that the true poison had not been ingested but spoken, and that the crossword, folded in my drawer, contained more medicine than the coroner's bottles ever would. Julian Wren was arrested in the pale light of a morning that smelled of damp paper and resignation. He admitted without flourish that he had met Latham at the bench. He had begged for money, he said, as though the confession might purchase forgiveness. Latham was already unwell, he insisted. He left him breathing, though weakly, and walked away beneath a sky that refused to notice. The diary page, torn, smudged, found in Latham's flat, spoke of a meeting at the bench after dark. Its edges felt too theatrical, like a letter drafted for discovery. Lewis, for once, was pleased. Open and shut, opportunity, motive, document. Wren in handcuffs. Case concluded. I could not join his satisfaction. The man had debts, yes, and perhaps grudges, but his guilt lacked the texture of truth. His words were fluent but over-rehearsed, like lines from a play where the actor knows the ending. Confession can be a mask as easily as silence. What gnawed at me, more than Wren's theatrical contrition, was the crossword. One clue refused rest. A seat that carries secrets. 5. I'd stared at it until the word bench inscribed itself across the squares. Too simple, too literal. Latham, master of precision, had chosen to misquote Houseman in the same puzzle. Why then would he also write such a pedestrian clue? Unless its plainness was disguise, unless the bench itself was the message. I returned to the Parks that evening. The bench sat obedient, damp as always, its slats darkened by the hour. My hand along the wood found again the faint carving beneath the varnish. Initials, softened almost to invisibility, not vandalism, but memory preserved. The crossword's clue was not metaphor, but map. I thought of Sylvia's mother, of the photograph in which Calder and Wren had framed her smile. I thought of Sylvia herself, who spoke of obligation with the exhaustion of someone raised on borrowed debts. The diary page, the confession, even the coroner's equivocations, all of them began to arrange themselves as red herrings, distractions scattered to satisfy men who preferred tidy endings. Lewis called as I sat there, his voice triumphant. Wren had signed a fuller statement. I told him to hold it like nettles, with care, and not too long. He asked if I doubted the man's word. I said only that a puzzle is not solved by filling boxes, but by noticing which clue refuses silence. The bench carried its secret still, and I began to suspect that Latham had left us not just a crossword, but an epitaph in code. The park had the sound of water without the kindness of rain. It was late, the hour when lamplight forgets its duty. I walked there because the case had begun to arrange itself as a circle, and circles demand a center. The bench waited with its familiar damp sheen, as if memory were a weather system visiting only this length of timber. I sat and let the cold pass through the coat I had not bothered to button. I told myself there was nothing left to find. The path had been combed, the coroner had recited, the college had rehearsed its grief. Yet the bench, obstinate as a riddle, kept its refusal. I slid my fingers beneath the lowest slat where varnish thins to truth. There, almost absorbed back into wood, a pair of initials endured, shy but legible when light struck at a slant. EL and SM. The ampersand felt too young for scholarship. I traced the groove again to be sure habit did not invent what hope desired. Not a vandal's boast. Tenderness leaves a different signature. EL was the easier half. Latham had loved many things in the accusative case, Poets, arguments, the clean edge of correctness, but here was evidence of a preference set in timber. SM arrived with a small chill. Sylvia's mother, the young woman in the photograph, had stood here with a knife sharp enough for initials and dull enough for consequence. It reassembled the decade with ruthless economy. Calder arranging the party as only a head of house arranges summer. Wren drifting through the frame like an alibi that drinks. The girl poised at the edge of permission. I saw again how Calder's eyes rested on people like a seal of quality, and how Wren's rested on opportunity. Between them, Latham, learning too late that meaning does not forgive. Secrets prefer furniture, I said. Cupboards, chests, benches. They do not thrive in minds. I imagined the carving at dusk when gardeners had withdrawn and porters were gossiping over tea. 2 letters and an ampersand, possession performing itself in miniature. When I rose, the bench offered another favor. A faint ridge of paler wood ran along the underside where the slat had once split and been mended. The kind of repair colleges order when they would rather not approve replacements, the kind that preserves both function and inscription. Whoever requested the mending knew what would be saved. I carried the discovery to Calder the next afternoon. He offered that smooth welcome of his and suggested the matter should rest for the sake of dignity. Dignity for the dead, he said, as if the phrase could patent itself. I told him only that wood remembers long after paper learns to forget. He said I mistook romance for method. Sylvia received the fact quietly. She looked at the envelope that held the photograph and then at my hands, as if the image had traveled the short distance by confession alone. She said her mother liked to sit where the light fell through leaves like advice. She added that Calder had once called often, and that Wren had called once too often. She did not say Latham's name, and I lacked the cruelty to offer it. Walking away, I asked the question I've asked too late in other lives. Are rivalries merely disagreements over footnotes, or are they the ash of passions burned badly? The answer declined to be plural. I reached the chapel and rested in the doorway, where wax lends the air an old sweetness. Vale passed and nodded with the careless intimacy of a man accustomed to keys. His eyes found the floor when I mentioned repairs. I returned to the bench at last light. The initials had accepted dusk and would not announce themselves again. I thought of Sylvia, who had inherited not only a mind, but a map of rooms where voices carry. If she had learned something from Latham on that final evening, it might have been the kind of truth that abolishes appetite. Some griefs ask nothing but silence. Some silences ask for company. I sat until the lamps remembered duty and left the park to its better secrets tonight. It was late when I asked Sylvia to meet me. The library was closed, the fellows retired. The quad stretched in damp silence. We sat in the senior tutor's office, the lamp angled low, a single circle of light in which the photograph rested like a reluctant witness. I slid it across the polished desk without preamble. She did not touch it. Her eyes moved once, then stopped. The mouth tightened, the throat worked, and silence unspooled itself between us. At last she said, "My mother," and then, as though the word required air, "My ruin." She folded her hands as though waiting for punishment. I told her nothing yet. I let the picture speak its older tongue. Her voice was not confession but exhaustion. Latham had told her, days before his death, that Calder had been the architect of her mother's departure. The affair, the whispers, the fear of scandal. Better a brilliant girl lost than a college shamed. She spoke as if repeating lines rehearsed in private. He destroyed her for the college. Sylvia whispered, and then smiled to the world as though nothing had been touched. I asked why Latham told her now. She said he had kept the photograph all these years, a relic he could neither destroy nor display. He said he wanted her to know, to carry the truth if he could not. On the night of his death she went to him, the diary page, the bench, the whisper of dew. He was already unwell, she said, his breath shallow, the heart refusing rhythm. She confronted him, the photograph trembling in her hand. He looked at it, she told me, and began to weep. Not for guilt, but for the cruelty of remembering. Then he clutched at his chest and folded himself into the bench's curve. I asked if she tried to help. She shook her head, hair falling like shutters. I had his medicine. He asked for it. I held it, and then she said the words with the finality of chiseled stone. A choice, not an act. She covered her face. It was not murder she carried, but the unbearable weight of inaction. She had let time do its work while she did nothing to interfere. I said nothing. There are silences one must guard. Lewis, in his untroubled earnestness, had already prepared the file for closing. Natural causes, he called it, a weak heart and a weary man. His relief was palpable. I let him have it. He deserved small victories. Calder would continue his careful guardianship of reputation, veil his Latin slips, Wren his debts. The photograph lay still on the desk, its faces smiling at a summer that had long since curdled. When Sylvia rose to leave, she placed the photograph back in the envelope and pushed it toward me. "Keep it," she said, as though relinquishing a relic too heavy to carry further. Her eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, and then she was gone, footsteps fading into the dark corridors, swallowed by boards that creaked as though reluctant to remember. Later I walked again through the parks. The bench greeted me with its usual sheen, damp though the evening was dry. I sat there, alone with a slow ache of whiskey in my blood. I imagined Latham's final moment, a man confronted not by poison or blade, but by truth, which corrodes more subtly than either, and Sylvia inheriting not only her mother's intellect, but her grief, sitting motionless beside him as the night recorded its indifference. Lewis will never know. The file will gather dust, one more neat ending in a city that lives on untidy ones. I lit a cigarette and let the smoke drift into the damp air. Some puzzles are solved, not by answers, but by absences. Some crimes are not acts at all, but choices made in silence. The bench remained wet. No rain had fallen. I left the park alone, the kind of alone that does not ask for company. Autumn had thinned the afternoon into a patient dusk. The paths glimmered with the memory of rain that never came. I walked without purpose, and with it, past the river that carries other people's secrets downstream and the oaks that keep their own. Behind me, the city prepared its lamps. Ahead of me, the light lowered like a lid. At the gate, I turned back. The bench lay in its accustomed hush. The grain darkened to a soft bruise. The case had ended as cases often do here, the paper satisfied, the heart not. In the quiet that follows completion, I heard the small sounds, the murmur of leaves, the distant clink of crockery from some staircase kitchen, the faintest nick of a bicycle bell, and it seemed to me that this was Oxford's true voice, courteous, tired, incurious. I thought of words misremembered and then restored, of medicines that console until they do not, of photographs that refuse to fade. I told myself that justice and mercy rarely travel together, but they sometimes nod on passing. I murmured Houseman this time correctly. And malt does more than Milton can to justify God's ways to man. The bench gleamed faintly in the twilight, its surface darkened as if by tears.